Hello and welcome to Enlightened Empaths with your hosts Samantha and Denise. This is our community for the spiritually awakened, and we are so happy to have you join us here this week when we're going to be sharing the hour with a very special guest. Denise, will you please do the honors of introducing our guest this week?
Our wonderful guest today is Asia Suler, and her onewillowapothecaries.com. Asia is a writer, teacher, herbalist, and energy worker who lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western North Carolina. She's the creator and concoctress, nice word, behind One Willow Apothecaries, an online library for nourished healing, handcrafted medicine. Asia's popular yearly online program, Intuitive Plant Medicine, is a guided initiation and cozy community dwelling for those who are ready to reopen the pathways of communication between themselves and the natural world. Asia began her journey into healing and plant-based medicine after early years of chronic pain. The experience, which pushed her into a deep search for healing, both within and without, led her to the altar of the green world. She began her formal study of herbs in 2011 with Juliet Blancaspor and the Chestnut School of Herbal Medicine, and has continued to study, seek, listen, and learn ever since. Asia holds a BA in English, Anthropology, and Native American Studies from Vassar College and a Reiki Master degree. Her training includes work with shamanic dream teacher Robert Moss, psychiatrist Brian Weiss, and Chinese stone medicine teachers Sarah Thomas and Jeffrey Ewan of the Jade Purity lineage. Asia works with clients at her apothecary on the island in the mountains of Western North Carolina, as well as online and at a distance. She facilitates workshops at schools and conferences across the country and is blessed to work intimately with people and plants, spirits, and stones. That is a beautiful, beautiful write-up. You're a very gifted writer, Asia.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here. Well, we're so happy to have you here. And after listening to that bio, I want to say, is that all you do? Come on now.
It's an interesting thing when you wear a bunch of hats to try and put them all in one closet, and I think bios are challenging in that respect.
I agree. Well, that is a very impressive one. I wanted to start just by sharing with listeners a little bit more about your journey. One of the things I was saying to you before we started recording was going to Vassar is no small thing. I mean, it's one of the top colleges in the country, if not the world. And to go there, I think, is quite an achievement all in and of itself. But then to have that degree that can open so many doors and to choose this authentic but still very different path, I think is almost more admirable. Can you kind of talk about how you got to Vassar and then how you decided, you know what, I'm going to go down this path of being this healer and this writer and this intuitive?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I got there just by working super hard, and I think that partially, part of my journey for sure was kind of trying to translate myself from a child who was very sensitive and, often very unfocused and, very emotional to, becoming someone who can focus her energy. And so it was a conscious decision that I made when I kind of knew that at this point in time, high school grades counted. And it was really like a challenge that I set myself, can I be someone who focuses their energy, who hones in, who really decides she wants to accomplish something and does. And so it was kind of a test for me. And also at the same time, I grew up in a pretty small town in Pennsylvania, and I kind of envisioned higher education as like my ticket out. And so I worked hard to just kind of make sure I had options. And so that's where it came from. And both my parents are in the academic world. So I was very lucky to have, role models of the idea that I could possibly go to higher education, that was achievable for me. So I ended up going to Vassar, and honestly, my education there was absolutely incredible. I'm also just a total school nerd. So knowing that my job there to learn was just really delightful. But when I look back on it now, I think the biggest reason I was called there was to learn from the teacher that is that land. Because at the time, and I mentioned this in my bio, but I developed a chronic pain condition called vulvodynia when I was in school, which basically is a scientific sounding word for your vulva is in pain and we don't know why. And so I was dealing with this pain condition for most of my time in school. And one of the things I say often is that, like, the world inside of my body was so painful that I started going out, and I started going outside. And basically Vassar is it's an arboretum, and they have woods, they have farmland, and I would just go out and wander. And I started feeling like I couldn't communicate with a lot of my peers because my experience of dealing with chronic pain just made me feel really different. And so I started talking to the plants. And so looking back on it now, I'm like, among the many other reasons why one is called to a place, I was called there to learn from that land and to have that experience of being in a place where I could wander in nature. And so when I graduated, I think at one point I was saying something to my mom about the things I wanted to do, and I was just sort of rattling off a bunch of stuff. I was like, I want to work with plants, but I also want to write poetry, and I'm also interested in stones, and I'm also what would it be like to learn how to weave a basket? And I was saying all these things, and apparently she kind of made a list, because she's like that, so she made a list for posterity, and we found it later. And she was like, I had no idea what you were talking about or how you were going to do all these things. And she's like, looking at your life now, though, strangely enough, these are all things that you're doing, and they turned out to just be all woven into what wasn't a major, but what was really ultimately the most interesting thing to me, which was really developing this relationship with what I call the living world, and that there's many gateways to do that, including, traditional craft, including these traditional methods of healing, including working with plants and stones, shamanism. So I think that my experience of having dealt with chronic pain and then also chronic illness just really kind of pushed me out of a lot of the traditional ways of moving through, the academic world and of seeking a life path, because I really, in some ways, I felt so failed by Western medicine in particular, but also in many ways there was aspects in which I felt kind of failed by the academic world too, in that the things that I was interested in, there was very few, professors even that were, also interested or wanted to support me or, was in their wheelhouse. And I think that there's a lot of starchiness in traditional academia that it doesn't recognize sort of that life force. I really feel like that's at the center of these disciplines and why we study what we study. So I graduated and thought that I would go on to get my master's at least, but most likely a PhD, and actually none of that has happened. What has happened is that I've just sort of spun off on this journey of self-study, and it really began with the plants. And so that was became my focus, was how can I interact with plants? So I ended up in Hawaii for a time working on a farm, and then I got a job in New York City working as a plant technician, which I promise you is probably a job that only exists in places like Manhattan. It basically means that I took care of people's office plants all day long, 5 days a week. But that was what I could find to get close to them. And then from there, I ended up, as I mentioned in my bio, coming down to Appalachia to study plants down here with the Chestnut School, and just everything else flowed out from there.
Wow, it's like you wove your own basket of your life. You wove all the parts of you into this beautiful basket of openness and receptivity. And I also like your story because so often we're taught by the old mystics, like Rumi comes to mind, that pain is often our greatest blessing. And sometimes when I'm going through my own pain and I read stuff like that, I want to say, oh, F you. I would like a blessing in the form of a lottery ticket. And yet, when you look back at your own life, you can see that pain really can be a blessing because it pushes us. And in your case, your pain actually pushed you outside, not even just spiritually or emotionally, but actually outside, which opened up a door to your true path, which is very inspiring.
Absolutely. Thanks for that reflection, Samantha.
How do you, when you say you connect with the plants and you started to talk to the plants, could you just tell people what does that mean and what does that look like to you?
Yeah, well, at the time when I was in school, there was a new program being started at the school, which became our Native American Studies program, and I had an amazing teacher there named Molly McGlennon, who's Anishinaabe, and so I started being exposed to Native viewpoints, history, what we would call spiritual beliefs, and it was like I was given language for something that I had always felt, and now was seeing that, this is not just a random felt sense that, maybe should be written off, but that this is something that is absolutely inherent to the indigenous peoples of this country. And then the further I went into just being educated and learning and realizing, these beliefs are cross-cultural to all land-based peoples around the world. And one of the central concepts was that you not only can talk to the living world, but that the world talks back, and that plants are, our ancestors. They are our caretakers. They are what make our lives possible, and that we have the ability to communicate with them. And so I, sort of following step with these different, authors and thinkers, I was going out and, in my way, communicating, which of course, right at the beginning, I thought, okay, I'm going to go out and talk to this tree. At the time, I couldn't even ID trees, right? I just knew, I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure that's a maple. Everything else, I have no idea. And so, I would go out and talk to some tree that, I felt drawn to, even though I didn't know its name. And at the beginning, right, I really hoped that I would hear kind of like the voice come down from heaven kind of deal, like the bolt of lightning, like that kind of communication. But I realized, and then since this, having studied the idea of the different clairs, that I'm actually clairsentient mostly, so I was just feeling things. So I would get over my feeling of shame or silliness, and oftentimes do this by finding a very quiet place where I couldn't be, overheard, but actually would literally then speak out loud to a plant and say, I'm Asia Suler, this is what I'm dealing with today, I'm feeling really sad, I'm having a hard time, can I have a hug? And I would literally hug trees and I would speak to them, and it was just the feeling that I got back. And to me, that feeling was when I say the plant spoke back, that was how I heard them. And it was this feeling of being so received, of being so loved and so held and so accepted just as I was. And just being in that moment of time in my life where I was struggling so much and feeling so sort of at odds with or at distance from the community that I was in, just because I wasn't having a very typical college experience because of my health issues, it was invaluable. And so, this is one of the things I say to people often too, is that when you start, quote unquote, talking to plants, you're going to feel really silly. And I think that this is actually super important because in my mind, I actually think about the role that silliness plays in sort of a childhood landscape. And so kids are silly all the time. And to them, silliness is like seeing what is the dominant norm, like what's the normal way to do things, what's the, kind of normal procedure, and then they turn it on its head for play. Like they see well, what happens if we do this a little differently? And to them, that's silly and it's hilarious. And I think we need more of this as an adult. And I think when we feel that silliness that comes up when we talk to plants, which oftentimes can then translate as shame, what we're actually sensing is that we're about to turn the dominant paradigm on its head, what we've been handed as the truth, as the normal right way to go about things. And that silliness is kind of an indicator of okay, we're about to play around with this. We're about to shapeshift some things. And I think that silliness is actually an important indicator that you're about to do something pretty big and revolutionary.
I want to jump in
Denise,
here. Yeah.
Go ahead. I have something I want to say. I don't want to take over.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, no, because as far as I walk through the woods a lot, and I'm drawn to certain trees, and the same thing I can't identify, but I can put my hands on trees and download. And there can be 5 trees that are all alike or the same species, and I'll walk over and I'll know exactly which tree I'll be drawn to a specific tree. and I'll just close my eyes and put my hands on the tree and feel that. And I had read this years ago, because I have some background with shamanic work as well, that they're antennas. They're a conduit between divinity and where we are on earth. So you have the roots, but you're also reaching up into to make that beautiful, beautiful column that connects us to all that is. And a couple of, I just want to jump in because I know Samantha's got a long list, is that, you know, when you said that you had that kind of awakening, a lot of people in their late teens, early 20s, that's when the intuition piece really kicks into gear. And what I love is that you took what you did and it can't be replicated. You've studied from all these people, but you've taken all the little tendrils and you've put them together to make it your own process and your own way of connecting, because you're so spot on with every plant has a unique energy. Every tree has a unique energy. And they may, similar to breeds of dogs, they may have certain characteristics, but each one is unique. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's that one-on-one relationship is where the healing happens. And that's something I'm super passionate about, is just recognizing that all healing happens through relationship, even if that relationship is taking, some sort of pill. It's still the relationship between our body and the pharmacology. But I think, all of our traditional healing happened in very personal relationships. And I think healing can go so much deeper when we have that one-on-one relationship. So I think everything you're saying is, absolutely spot on and so important to remember.
And as far as it being a healer, the plants being healers, what I love is how things change I just have a yard in town, but how things will show up that I need to have in my life. And there's the perennials that have always been there and the certain things, but certain wildflowers will just show up, or certain other plants will just, all of a sudden there'll be a plethora of those in a certain part of my yard where they've never been. And I talked to a woman here in Maine a couple of years ago, and she said, the earth will always bring you what you need to heal. And that's always stuck with me, because that seems to be a really strong premise with a lot of your work. So.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
I feel like you're intuitive, Asia, because one of the questions I was going to ask you, I mean, I know you're intuitive, I'm joking, but one of the questions I wanted to ask you was about feeling silly, because I just think that's the biggest stumbling block for so many people when they do want to hug a tree. You think about the condescending phrase, "Oh, you're a tree hugger." And so I wanted to ask you, how do you work around silliness? And you already answered it when you said it's actually a positive sign that you're taking this shift, this turn in your own development. One of the things I was saying to my children, we were up in Asheville last week and, in the woods every day, and there was this one tree that I had to hug, and my girls were like, "Oh my God, Mom, you're so embarrassing." And I was like, look, I'm already a psychic. Like, I've filled up my checklist of embarrassing you. And I was thinking as we continued walking, comedians can say whatever the hell they want and get away with it because they're comedians. It kind of gives them that permission. And I feel like the minute I labeled myself a psychic, it gave me permission to do quote unquote weird things like hug a tree. And as I was walking down that path, I thought, I wish I had given myself that permission before I put that label on myself. And I like that you just said it's okay to feel silly if you're hugging a tree or trying to talk to a plant in your garden or your flower box, because it's actually a sign that you're opening up and seeing the connection between all is. So I wanted to thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you, have you read all those to me, they're recent studies that are coming out about where science is proving that plants talk to each other, that they actually send messages through their roots, telling them like, "Oh, aphids are coming," or "shade is over there," or "don't grow too much over here. We can't compete." Have you read those?
Yeah, and it's super interesting. It's cool when science starts to catch up with what traditional people have known for a long time, and this is an example of that. And yeah, I mean, they're finding, at first they were looking at this and they were finding that basically that trees are communicating with each other through this network of fungi called the mycorrhizal network, which underlays our world and is very dense, in particular in forests. And so it's this fungal connection, basically, through which a lot of information and nutrients can be sent. And so what was interesting is when they first started studying it, they were looking at parent and child trees. So that would be, larger trees of one species and smaller trees of the same species. And oftentimes they would be their literal offspring, and finding this connection of communication, which makes a lot of sense. And it fit into, kind of the model that we have of this being like competitive, sort of Darwinistic kind of world. But then they started doing other research and finding, it's not just that it's within species, it's actually like interspecies communication between these trees. And so they are, across these species boundaries, helping to support each other, helping to communicate to each other. So like you said, letting other trees know when, there's an infestation of a particular type of insect, so that way they can, up certain constituents in their leaves, for example, to make them less tasty. They will also do things like actually pass literal nutrients along to a tree that is ailing. So there's been interesting studies where there was a tree that, for all intents and purposes, should have died because of storm damage or because of human damage, and they're like mystified at why this tree is still alive. And they find that actually it's because all the surrounding trees are sending them nutrients to keep this one being alive. And so it really changes this whole sort of base level concept that I think we're given in very early on, that that the living world is about competition, and that's how evolution works, but that it's actually about cooperation, and that it's the cooperation and the community aspects that actually drives evolution in life. And that, to me, is just amazing.
And it ties back into the indigenous way of looking at life, that it's a community, it's a collaborative effort. It's not the individual, it's the whole, which is very cool.
Yeah.
Now, I have a question. I always tell people, if you're drawn to a certain crystal, there's a reason. Either you're supposed to work with that crystal, or an event is coming up in your life where you will need the qualities of that crystal. Would the same apply to a plant? If someone is, for example, suddenly attracted to growing lavender or rosemary, does that mean something?
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that I say to people in working with plants, because we can kind of get in our heads and we're like, I want to find the right one. I want to make the right connection. And so we're doing all this research and we're asking other people what they think. But I tell people, go based on affinity. Like, what flower do you just love? What is really capturing your curiosity, your attention right now? Like Denise, you said, like, what just showed up around your house that you're like, oh my gosh, who are you? Mm-hmm. And it really is, that's exactly how it works. And the plants are pretty mobile. And in fact, they can be more mobile than stones in a lot of ways, because, they have all these means to actually get around, other than, humans or tectonic forces, etc. So they will seek you out, like they will come to you. And if you have an affinity for a particular plant, like that is always the strongest place to start.
I think
that is so cool. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to mention that, the premise of our show is we do talk to empaths. And I was talking to a dear friend of mine who realized she was a plant empath. And we were comparing it to being, someone who connects with other human beings, with animals, with the energies of the world. But the energies with plants are a specific type of empath. And I was wondering if you could share a basic way that someone may either have an idea if that's something that's a strong point for them, or a way that they could try to connect with a plant. Because I know you can, even if we're going back to Manhattan, even if you're in the middle of a city, you can connect with a house plant, with a plant on your patio, with a terrace garden. It doesn't have to be out in the woolies. But I think a lot of folks listening might like a little clue on how will I know if I'm connecting, or what would be a way I could try to connect.
Right. Well, I very much identify as being an empath. It's something that I've grappled with forever, in positive ways and also challenging ways. And I one of the things I really believe is that we are all plant empaths on a level. Some of us might innately be more tuned in than others for various reasons, but we wouldn't have survived as a species if we weren't plant empaths. And if you ask a lot of native peoples, traditional land-based peoples, well, how did you know that this was used for that, or this, this plant helps with that? And early ethnographers asked this, and then they totally discounted what they heard, which was basically the plants told us. And so this is like very, in some ways very basic, but for us in sort of Western world is very novel. But I think that if we weren't plant empaths, we wouldn't be here. And so that's one of the things I'm passionate about, helping people to recognize within themselves, that is, we all have this ability to communicate with the plants, because they are literally what make our lives possible, from the houses that we live in, the clothes that we wear, the food that we eat. So I think we all have this ability, and the truth is that plants are always calling you to be in a relationship, and no matter where you are, there are plants there. So like you said, even if it's just a potted plant in your office, or if there's a dandelion growing up in the cracks of the pavement, outside of your house, the amazing thing is that plants will never stop trying to reach us. And even if you just sit still for a moment, or if you, don't clean out your gutters, there comes a plant to come and meet you. And so the steps of connecting with a plant are actually really simple. And I think all the ritual that we have developed around interacting with plants, or, being in ceremony with plants, all that ritual is actually just helping to get our mind on board with the idea that, okay, I'm doing something that's different than my normal, modus operandi, but really the basics of it are simple. And so I often tell people, number one, start where you are. You don't have to go to Peru and, work with a shaman in the Andes to make these connections. You really don't. Start exactly where you are. Notice who is growing around you. So, take stock of who is there, whether that is a potted plant or, a plant who is growing in your yard, and, introduce yourself. And this is where the silliness factor is going to come in. You're, going to probably feel really awkward. So, try doing this first when no one else is around. But I really liken plant relationships to relationships with humans. And so imagine if you went to a party and you wanted to get to know someone, you would probably go up and introduce yourself, and you would say where you're from. You would strike up a conversation. And I think the problem is that what we do often as human beings, but especially in like the plant and herbal world, is it's like, it would be like going up to someone at a party and saying, "Hi, what are you good for?" And we do this all the time with plants, but they're so forgiving. But still, it's like, if we want to really develop a connection, a relationship, we need to approach it with respect and honor. And this is also a way of signaling to our brain, which often has been very patterned to see plants as non-conscious entities. It's patterning our brain to actually see this being as sentient, to introduce yourself. So this is really more for your benefit than the plant. But so you introduce yourself, and then initiate intimacy. So if we want like really deep, juicy relationships, we need to get intimate. So, we need to spend time with someone to notice, the way they look, the way they smell, how they carry themselves in the world, the way they dress. And the same goes for plants. And so there is this basic concept in herbalism called the doctrine of signatures. And basically what that means is that the way that a plant grows, or how it looks, or the conditions in which it grows, all are indicative of how its medicine might actually be used inside of a human body. So you've probably seen sometimes there's memes that go around online that are like, walnuts look like brains and they're good for brains. It's similar to that. And so it's this doctrine of signatures idea. And so when we initiate intimacy and really, look at the plant, try sketching the plant, touch the plant if it's not poisonous, if it's edible, try a little nibble, to really spend concentrated time with the plant, we start to notice these subtleties and these details. And from there, we can actually start to read the metaphors. And so our mind actually is constantly working in metaphor and trying to find likeness and simile in all of our experiences. And so this is actually how we will begin to receive messages from the plants. For many people, is through, noticing these metaphors, and you will notice that something is true for you or feels, metaphorically potent for you because it will hit you in an emotional way. So maybe it's, for example, that dandelion growing up in the crack in the sidewalk, and you notice, wow, like no other plant is thriving here. This plant is tenacious, is brave, is making the best out of a toxic situation, and then it might hit you like, wow, that's where I'm at in my life right now too. I'm in a really hard situation, and I'm just trying to make the best of it, and like here is this plant coming and reflecting back to me, this sort of metaphoric journey that I'm on. And so those are the things that I tell people, and there's so many ways to, initiate intimacy, but this is where I think having certain practices, for example, like knowing how to make a flower essence, or knowing about how to make yourself an infused tea, or even, being familiar with a talismanic practice, which just means having a piece of that plant and keeping it on you, in a little pouch, or, in a piece of fabric on your body or just on your bedside table, that too is medicine. So just having a few key practices that then you can keep touching base with this plant will keep the medicine alive.
The way you described that, though, it immediately felt the same as when I connect to someone in spirit or I connect with the energy of an animal. It's just that the plants are vibrating at a certain frequency, and you adjust your frequency to match the energy that's coming from the plant, is what it really felt like. And it makes them very much a sentient being.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a little herb garden, and I don't really know what to do with a lot of the herbs. I mean, obviously, I use my basil to make pesto. I use my mint when I make tea. But I'm growing lavender and chamomile, and I would love to make a tea out of it, but I'm kind of afraid to. There's bugs on it all the time. We have a family of bunnies in my yard now that, they eat the garden a lot, and I'm okay with that. What do I do with the lavender and chamomile to make a tea? Like, how do you cut it? Is there a certain way to cut it? Is there a way to cleanse the leaves you've seen bugs on?
Yeah, well, so, in terms of like cutting flowers, I mean, I'm positive that you know this, but in case people who are listening don't, that just like haircuts are often the way I think about it, is like, just giving them, maybe even like weekly haircuts can be really helpful, especially for something like chamomile, something that grows like that sort of like grows in a wide mat. It's like if you, normally like you deadhead flowers to keep getting more flowers. So you would do that with chamomile. You would keep cutting it to get more flowers. And so you would sort of, add a little more to the basket or screen every week to dry them if you wanted to dry them, keep them as tea. Lavender, I find oftentimes you let it grow till you get the long spikes, and then you cut it back, and you can get a couple harvests a year out of lavender doing it that way. And then, at the end of the year, you really cut it back far, which is what lavender likes. But so, it depends on the herb, but those are, generally with most plants, you can get a couple harvests out a season. And I know I made the mistake when I had my first garden when I was living in New York City. Everything was so precious to me. I didn't want to cut anything, so everything just grew really long and leggy and seeded really early because I just couldn't bring myself to cut it, and I didn't understand that was like would create, more abundance and better growth. But so that's what I would say. And if for things like lavender and chamomile, like that these are safe herbs to work with internally. I mean, it's a totally different story if you don't know that they're safe to work internally. Like, that's super important then to figure out your plant ID and do your research. But with those, like, I always really encourage people to experiment, because that's how you figure out what you like and what works for you, and that's how you actually figure out what doesn't work. So, like, I've definitely made the mistake of putting too much lavender into tea, and you will know it. It will not taste good, and then you will never make that mistake again. And I think the cool thing about experimenting is that then you really learn by like feel how much herbs to add in. Most herbalists, when you ask about tea blends, they're like, yeah, I do a pinch of this, a pinch of that. It's sort of like, people who cook a lot. And I think that that's actually a really empowering thing to learn. It's like, okay, it's the way like this amount of pinch feels in my hand is the perfect amount of lavender for this tea. And I think that, again, it comes then back to that like relationship idea, is that you're kind of in this like, working creative, artistry with the plants then, and it feels very creative and artistic when then you're going off of, your felt sense of things rather than following a recipe.
I did the same thing with my first garden. I would not cut anything. And then when I did start deadheading it and cutting it back, I would always go out with my scissors and say, I'm so sorry. This will actually help you. But when I would read the Farmer's Almanac, it'll have little articles that'll say, like, best to cook or best to cut basil after a new moon, or best to cut this herb back on a full moon. And I thought, I didn't know that. Is there truth to that, or is that more lore?
I think there's definitely truth to that. I mean, even just the basics of, on a full moon, more light is reaching the earth, and so plants are growing more. And so plants do go through a little bit of a cycle in terms of like higher growth around the full moon, and then sort of, slowing the growth towards the new moon. So I think there's definite truth and weight to that. And I can't say that's something that I'm super well versed in besides just the basics that I shared. But once you start going into that world, you're like, wow, this is deep.
For empaths and sensitives in particular, we tend to feel drained a lot. What flower essences would you recommend for that feeling of, oh, I've taken on too much this week?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's so many good ones. So I actually have a article I recently published on my blog called Flower Essence for Boundaries. And there are a couple flower essences on there that I talk about pairing them with different acupuncture points that I find really helpful. But so there's a couple that I mentioned on there, and I can mention a few more. But you want to just think about what are plants that that hold really good boundaries, because that's the thing with being a sensitive or an empath, is that our boundaries are, can be very slim, which is a beautiful thing, but also it's really challenging. So you want to look at plants that are good boundary holders. So one plant that probably a lot of people maybe wouldn't think of, but is very powerful in this way, is poison ivy. And so, you don't have to touch poison ivy or anything like that. But if you have poison ivy growing around you or near you, or poison oak, depending on where you are in the country, try in meditation connecting to that plant. Poison ivy only grows in places that have been disturbed by humans. And as far as we know, human beings are the only creatures on the planet that are allergic to poison ivy's urushiol oil. So there's a very strong message here, which is that poison ivy comes in areas that have been tread upon and disturbed, and says, no more. Like humans, it's time for you to stay out. And so there's something super powerful here about those of us who are empaths and feel like our inner space is kind of constantly being, clear cut, tread upon, otherwise, violated and sort of degraded in this way, even if it's not intentional, right? A lot of times people are just, walking that same trail and not realizing that it's starting to erode. But poison ivy, just on an energetic or spiritual level, or working with, a carefully diluted flower essence, which would make it a homeopathic, that's a way to work with strong boundaries. Another really traditional one for boundaries is hawthorn, which is very safe to imbibe in all its forms as a tincture or a tea. You can work with the flowers or the berries. And so in Celtic lore, hawthorn was considered to be this tree that was the gatekeeper between the realms. So hawthorn, oftentimes you would maybe fall asleep under a hawthorn tree and you would end up in the fairy realm. And so it's this otherworld tree that also on a physical level has this ability to really help heal grief, sadness, anxiety. It is now we know it's a cardiotonic. It actually makes the muscle of our heart stronger, but it was a very traditional tree to work with for states of acute loss and grief. And one of the things that, if you look at the lore, that I find really interesting is that this idea that, even in moments of grief, for example, the way that we heal is through having good boundaries, through knowing, there's certain things I don't have to engage with right now. I can just be in this experience. Grief itself is a kind of boundary that's helping us to process what has gone on. And one of the ID characteristics of hawthorn are these thorns. So they get these beautiful flowers around Beltane, which is in May, the Celtic holiday of fertility. And then it gets these red berries, sometimes orange, around Samhain, which is around what we call Halloween in the fall, which was this time of really connecting into the other side of the veil. And in between and all year long, it has these long thorns. And so the idea being that if we want to connect into real states of, deep understanding, magic, to, feel safe enough to sort of cross these boundaries between the world. And I think for empaths, this is so much of who we are, is being tuned into that, then you need good boundaries. And so hawthorn is a really beautiful plant that helps to teach us that. And the last one I want to mention, which is not in this blog post I described, but is one that oftentimes people in the healing arts talk about, is pink yarrow. Pink yarrow is specifically indicated for people who are empaths who work in healing professions and tend to pick up a lot of what their clients are going through, a lot of emotions that aren't theirs, even, physical bodily stuff. Yarrow is a plant that grows, many different ecosystems around the country. It's considered a weed plant in a lot of places. Back during the Civil War, it was called soldier's wort. And so wort's just an old word for plant, but they called it that because basically it was used for everything having to do with healing the most common things that killed soldiers. So it was a disinfectant. It's an important astringent to stop things like dysentery, which really is one of the biggest killers on the battlefield. And so it was this very strong protective herb. And even if we look at old lore, if we look at the tale of Achilles being, dipped by his heel in this magical vat, so everything else was invincible but his heel, what he was dipped in some accounts was yarrow tea. And so yarrow is a strongly protective herb, and pink yarrow in particular is thought to then just really have this affinity for the emotional body and for the empath in particular. So those are just three ideas. I mean, I there's so many plants that you could work with just based on what's in your area. Look at, are there any plants around you that have thorns or that have poisonous components or that, seem to be strong boundary holders, say on the, edge of your property line. Those are some ideas to connect to around you, but plants are really so good at helping those of us who are empaths to have stronger boundaries.
And ivy, Denise, who knew? I love the hawthorn and the pink yarrow, but to do a meditation with poison ivy to set boundaries, that's so helpful and interesting. Wow, go ahead, Denise.
Oh, no, I was just thinking that a lot of fields where they've put in athletic fields or cleared land for subdivisions, on the periphery, there's usually either poison oak or poison ivy, and I never made the connection that it's when the earth has been disturbed that's where it shows up. And also I was wondering if someone has, my sister has severe allergic reaction to poison ivy, so all of those things, and I'm wondering, is there something within you that needs to be healed if the plant reacts so strongly with you?
Yeah, I actually have seen with a lot of friends and clients that when you have a very strong reaction to poison ivy, that there is this possibility of healing through making this connection in a more, emotional, spiritual, energetic way. I found that, doing meditations with the plant, obviously not touching it, but reaching out in that way, and also taking a homeopathic of poison ivy, which would include something like a flower essence, which doesn't have any physically viable constituents, but contains the energetic imprint of the plant, can help to, understand what the message is. Because the interesting thing is the oil of poison ivy, the urushiol oil, it's not inherently aggravating. It's just our body that has a histamine response to it. So it's fascinating that there's some people that don't have any reaction and some people that do. And I think as with anything that's like there's a strong reaction or charge, there's a strong lesson or learning there.
I agree. Very, very cool.
Can I ask another question, Denise, or do you want to jump in?
No, I was waiting because I knew that it was like a little kid sitting on the edge of a bench. Okay.
I'd love for you to tell listeners about your earth alchemy elixirs on your website. I just thought that was really cool that you combine your elixirs with crystals like the ghost pipe and carnelian. Can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, sure. So I started with studying plants, and stones didn't come till a little while later, but then when they came in a really big way. And I got really excited about studying the mineral realm, and I ended up, part of my studies ended up being in this lineage that comes from ancient Taoism, this jade purity lineage. So a lot of people don't know this, but actually classical Chinese medicine includes a lot of stone prescriptions, and the ancient Taoists worked with stones very literally as medicine. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, stones actually work on the deepest level of our being. So in certain traditions of Chinese medicine, there's 3 energetic levels of formation to our being. So there's the outermost level, which is this way level, which is really like the surface. This is where you get like colds and flus, that type of stuff. And then you go 1 level in, which is the yin level. And this level is where often more chronic issues reside. Some of the deeper systems in our, bodies, like our, bones, the endocrine system, that kind of stuff. And plants are often really good at the way level and the yin level. They can go really deep. But then there's the deepest level of our being. That's the yuan level. And the yuan level is really more of this non-physical level that, goes to things like soul contracts and the dreams and the unconscious and life between life stuff. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, stones are really good at that yuan level. Like they really can go there. And as with anything, it's like plants could go to any level, stones could go to any level. It's just about like where they really shine. And so I love the idea of bringing plants and stones into combination, because then it's like we're working on and able to address like every level of our being. And I truly believe that most things that we're dealing with in our physical body are emanating out of this deep yuan level, especially if it's something really challenging that we're working with, whether it's, something like emotional or an anxiety disorder, or it's something very physical. And so I'm like, how can we really see and absorb the lessons in the deepest way possible that maybe, the vehicle for the lesson is no longer needed, which would be, what it is that we're experiencing in our physical body that's sort of causing disruption. And so I had this idea to pair together plants and stones. And honestly, the plants and the stones love being together, because basically stones are to plants what plants are to humans. Like stones in the mineral world is what make the lives of plants possible. They are the ancestors of the plants, just like how plants make our lives possible, and they're our ancestors. So working with them together is really potent. So when I started this line, it started with just like a pairing that came to mind. I was out with this mimosa tree, which if you've never seen these mimosa trees, they're so beautiful. These trees they're from Asia, but they've naturalized in many parts of the U.S. They're even considered kind of weed trees in some places, but they have these like beautiful pink powder puff flowers that look like something out of a fairy tale. And I was just with one of these trees, and I got such a strong message to pair with this stone kunzite. And so that's really where it started. And both the stone and the tree have these very traditional uses in Chinese medicine for, cultivating heart happiness and joy and, sort of exuberant celebration of life. And so, it sort of just started evolving from there. And the one that you mentioned, Samantha, is ghost pipe and carnelian. And that was another one where I was just sitting with ghost pipe in the forest, and carnelian just sort of like waltzed into the room kind of. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so ghost pipe, if anyone's unfamiliar with that, is it is a plant, but most people confuse it with mushrooms because it doesn't have chlorophyll. It's this sort of white, downward facing crone-like flower that grows up out of specific mycorrhizal networks. Like it needs very specific fungal conditions in order to grow. And it's pretty exotic once found because it's somewhat rare, especially in certain parts of the country where there's a lot of overharvesting at this point. And what's really fascinating is that this plant was used for what was traditionally considered a lot of signs of quote-unquote possession, which now we would say might be things like epilepsy, seizures. It was often used when people were having really extreme pain to actually be able to put the pain beside you. So it's different than some traditional painkillers like opium, where it kind of like your consciousness is really altered. With ghost pipe, it's almost like you can still see that the pain's there, but it's just right next to you, and so you're not feeling it as much. And so on an energetic level, there is this aspect to ghost pipe of helping us move through really painful times and sort of put the pain beside us in times where we feel almost like possessed by things like depression or anxiety. And I feel like if you've ever, grappled with, these sort of quote unquote mental illnesses, it often does feel like possession. You're like, where is this coming from? Like, why can't I get rid of this? It feels like it's like controlling my life and my emotions. And so ghost pipe on an energetic level, carries that ability to help us with that. And then in Chinese medicine, carnelian's considered like the, what they would call like, anti-possession stone. And I think it's really important when we talk about something like possession to be clear that, from a Chinese medicine perspective, like I said, like, emotions can be possessions, memories can be a possession, like something that just like haunts you. Anything that haunts you would qualify as, quote unquote possession in Chinese medicine. So it's different than, something like The Exorcist, like, sort of cancel that out of your mind. We're not talking about that. But so in that mind, basically carnelian was the stone that was used to like, sort of help you release the stuff that you're holding on from the past that's still haunting you. And so the two of them just seemed like such a natural pairing. And yeah, so I'm always excited talking about that one in particular because that's one that many, many people are drawn to. And I think it's because we have a lot of ghosts. And again, like, ghosts are anything that haunt you from a Chinese medicine perspective. So we have a lot of ghosts in our culture at this time. And I think that many of us are wanting and ready to sort of do this work of letting go of the things that are, attached to us, that are preventing us from really stepping into the fullness of our potential, of our happiness, of what's really possible.
It's a beautiful way to word it, that we all have many, many ghosts. You talk about these essences and these elixirs. What's your favorite way to use these elixirs? Like in tea, on your tongue, on wrist? Is one better than the other?
I don't think any one is better than the other. I think that whatever you feel drawn to is perfect for me, because sometimes I get, just like sidetracked and busy in my life. Just having it on me and taking it throughout the day, like on my tongue, or even underneath my tongue is normally how I do it. I often keep essences on my altar, and I try to sit with my altar in the morning and at night, even if just for a couple minutes. So then at least I know I'm taking them twice a day, and often taking them twice a day in kind of like a moment of calm. So I love that, but I also do think it's really powerful to use them on different points on the body, like the wrists, or if you're familiar with any like acupressure points that really work for you, to use them on those points, because those are, these meridians throughout our body. It's like those are the gateways into this meridian, and I find that it can often have like really immediate effects to use them on different points like that. So obviously, if that's not something about, then that's fine, see what comes to you with time. But if you are aware that like, oh, it feels really good to like, I had an acupuncturist show me, like, just hold this one little point on my foot to try an essence there and see how it feels.
Which ties in with the whole mind-body connection and the different energies of all these different, the plants, the animals, the stones, and as so many folks that I talk to that listen to the show that are empaths, that, our sensitivity is becoming more and more acute. And I agree with you 100%. We're at this amazing shift energetically with people stepping more into their power, more into their light, and finding what truly, truly resonates with them on a core level. And it may be the plants, it may be the stones, but whatever that is that helps you make that connection to your own divinity is so, so, so important right now for the energies and where we're going.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree.
And I just have to give a plug. A dear, dear friend of mine just finished up with your online course, and I'm going to try not to cry. It absolutely changed her life. And I'm not saying that to make you feel good or anything, but I've known this woman for decades and decades, and I'm going to cry because you brought my friend back. You helped her find that in herself, and it has just truly, please continue doing your work, because it's amazing to have watched the transformation of someone come back to their truest self and find, you just have no idea the impact you've made on someone's life. It's incredible. So thank you.
Wow,
Yeah.
Denise, thank you so much for sharing that with me. It's just, I'm going to cry. That's so profound to receive. And I think to me, this is why the plants are speaking to us so strongly, and why I'm doing what I'm doing is because we all have medicine, and
Yes.
This medicine is trying to get us to remember our medicine.
Exactly. Yes.
Well said. Wow. That's the best testimonial ever, Denise. That's awesome.
And coming from this friend, it's so genuine and heartfelt and highly, highly intuitive, very sensitive woman, with such a connection to earth energy and plants and animals. And again, when you know someone that dearly and you see this profound an impact, keep shining your light, girl, because it's making a huge difference.
Wow, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Well, right now I feel like, the earth is trying to communicate with us, and the earth is waking up more light workers to remember you are a light worker, you are a healer, and to have that empowerment within ourselves. And I think people like you are doing this for everyone. There's a woman, I can't remember her name, she was being interviewed on Coast to Coast a couple of months ago. She just did, I think, her third or fourth documentary on crop circles. And, everyone thinks crop circles, aliens, or hoax, right? But she worked with all these scientists, and she came on Coast to Coast to announce that what they have discovered, in her opinion, and the scientists she teamed up with opinion, the crop circles are the earth. It's the earth speaking to us.
Oh, I have chills. So amazing.
I listened to her and I thought, what? Like, what is the earth trying to say to us? But then when you were talking about how poison ivy only grows, where humans are treading too much, it makes sense. It makes sense that the earth would speak to us in this way.
Yeah, it does. Well, and, we notice how these incredible patterns of sacred geometry happen in nature. Like, why couldn't that happen? The energy like emanating out of a field. I mean, it's stunning, but like, why not? I mean, that's amazing. I want to look this up.
Exactly. Why not? It's so true. Now, people will always say to me, like, okay, what crystals do you recommend that people have? And I love and hate that question because it's kind of impossible to answer. But I will usually say, I think everyone should try to work with clear quartz, labradorite, amethyst, and then a grounding and charging stone like carnelian. So I'm going to ask you the same question for plants, and you don't have to answer it because I know it's a hard one. But are there go-to plants that you recommend newbies who don't have even a green or a brown thumb start with?
Yeah, so that is a really hard question, Samantha. But
I know. Sorry.
But no, but it is good. It is good though, because it's like I remember when I was first getting started in this world, I thought I knew. I had no idea. I mean, my first day in herbal school, I was like, wow, I know nothing. And so, it is really good to have a jumping off point. I would definitely say the quote-unquote weeds are the best place to start because they're ubiquitous. They're pretty much growing everywhere. They're probably around you somewhere. And so many of our weeds are so nutritious and medicinal and have such strong medicine. Like, I think about these weed plants as the ones that are like, sort of reclaiming our cities and love us so much that they won't leave us alone. So dandelion is definitely a huge one and one that many people start with. I think because there's so much tenacity there and so much bravery, like willing to just like be yourself and shine your light wherever, even when it's like no one wants you to be there, which is like the plight of dandelions. Dandelions are so smart too. Like if you have dandelions growing in your yard and you regularly mow, the dandelion figures out how to flower basically at the surface of the earth beneath where the blades will go to like continue its life force. I mean, it is the smartest plant and has so many medicinal and like edible uses. So I would definitely say dandelion is an awesome one to start with that many people are really drawn to. Violet is another one that is such a gateway plant for many, many people. Violets are, again, like a weed plant that will grow in a lot of wayside places. Another plant that has like strong medicinal and edible properties. But violet, to me, also on an energetic level, very much holds this medicine of it being really okay to, sort of be on your own, to venture down a path that maybe your fellow, humans aren't walking down with you right now. Maybe your family doesn't understand. Maybe you're like, your partner doesn't get it. Violet is very much about like that sacred aloneness, like it being really okay to take that journey. So I find that violet often is one that really opens a lot of gateways for people. And then, in terms of just like other weed plants growing around you, and you notice I'm mentioning plants that hopefully you can find growing around you, because I do think that in terms of this plant spirit connection, actually being able to have an interaction with the living plant will make that experience so much more deep than if you're just buying the bulk herb from somewhere. So the third one I would recommend as a starting off place is chickweed. Chickweed is another one that grows in a lot of wayside places, and it's like one of the most nutritious plants ever, and we don't ever eat it in our culture, but it was actually considered like a convalescent food. And it was like a food that's so highly nutritive that you would feed to people who hadn't eaten in a long time or weren't able to keep down food. Like you would start with chickweed. Chickweed comes about in the spring and then again in the fall, and you'll often find it growing like in your garden beds or in your flower pots. But it's so gentle, cooling, soothing, and it's really, chickweed's very just like, it's a soft entry point. It's like this feeling of like there's so much nourishment for you here, and you don't even have to do that much to start to receive it. So I think that that's another great plant to start to make a connection with.
Those are wonderful suggestions. Now, if people go to your website, One Willow Apothecaries, and we'll post links to Asia's website, and I'm going to post some things with the plants that she recommends that she just mentioned too, so you don't have to write them down, everyone. But you can also find a listing of the flower essences and the alchemical elixirs that she sells, and there's all links to her online courses that Denise was just mentioning. You also do intuitive development retreats in the winter. Could you talk about those before we have to wrap up?
Yeah, I would love to. So there's a class that I've been teaching every winter for a while now called Winter Intuition School. 1 year, the student said it's more like Winter Intuition School Experience, and now it's called WISE. The acronym for it is WISE. But basically, the school or the program is this invitation to explore several different gateways to connecting into your intuition. Because the thing is, it's like not not every gateway will work for every person or be the most vivid. And so the program highlights the gateways that have been most profound for me, because that's what I know about and feel like I could pass on and teach. And it's really just, it's like this introduction to these ways of communicating with what I talk about as your widest self. So that's the term that I often use, of communicating with your widest self and that guidance that is there. So the program includes, learning shamanic techniques like shamanic journeying and sort of the basics of what we call shamanism. We do stuff with past life recall and past life regression techniques, which is always super fascinating. We do dream work, being able to talk about our dreams, workshop our dreams, re-enter our dreams, remember our dreams. And then we also go into stones and plants as gateways. So we talk about healing with crystals, and because my background is in this sort of Taoist realm of things, we talk about Chinese medicine and stones and stone treatments. And then the last sort of gateway we enter into is plant spirit medicine, which is really what we've been talking about today. So I love this class so much. Every year it's so profound, but also so much fun. It's just like such an amazing experience to get together with a group of truly kindred spirits. And I think that this has been a huge draw for the experience, is that there's many people out there who, I live in Asheville. It's like I live in a very dense fishbowl of people who might talk about things like stones and plants and past lives. But most people in this country in particular, but in the world as well, probably don't live in places like that where they have people they can talk to about these things, or, talk about their dreams or their visions without people thinking that they're crazy. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest draw of this course, is that people get together with really kindred spirits and explore these things and these ways, these methods, these gateways of learning what works for you to be able to have this dialogue with your wider knowing.
And you're out in Asheville. I mean, that's what I think is so cool. I mean, people get to go to Asheville. They get to eat, like you said on your website, that the Fig restaurant does all the catering. I just ate there and loved everything there. So I think just being able to learn from you for a while is wonderful enough. But there's something about Asheville. I have to go there at least twice a year to kind of recharge my batteries. I really feel like the veil is thinner there. And I feel like the people there are so open and tuned in and connected. In almost every restaurant we went to, there was a sign that said, "You are safe here." All genders, all races, all nationalities, all humans accepted and welcomed here. And I thought, wow, you would never see that sign in my town. And I just love the energy of that whole part of the country.
Yeah, it is. There is something really, really special about these mountains. And they're some of the oldest mountains in the world. Like at one point in time, these mountains were higher than the Himalayas. And now they're like these soft grandmother curves. And there's so much wisdom in such old mountains like these. And so, I mean, they totally captured me. I came down here and thought I'd just stay for a while and learn. And they were like, you're staying for good. And I'm like, that's it. I've handed in my passport and I'm here to stay. So yeah, there's something like really incredible about being in this spot in particular.
Wow, I agree. Denise, do you have any other questions before we finish up?
No, I just want to say thank you so very much for sharing your wealth of information and your outlook and your beautiful, beautiful connection with earth energy and plant medicine. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been such an awesome conversation. So many just truly wonderful questions. And I'm such a fan of you both in this podcast. So it's just such an honor to be here.
Well, thank you. And we would love to have you back to continue this discussion. I have so many more questions. But we recommend that everybody check out Asia's website, One Willow Apothecaries. And you can find her wonderful blog on there that has a lot of her writings. And I will post a link to her most recent blog on our Facebook page. She has the most recent blog is about how Asia now calls herself a retired nice girl. I just love that phrase, and I want to steal it and own it. It's all about setting boundaries, as we were talking about with our poison ivy discussion. So please check out her website and all the wonderful things that she's offering, but especially her writings that are so instructive and help us remember that we are all connected to each other and to the nature around us. Like I said, I will post a lot of links connected to this episode on our Facebook page, Enlightened Empaths. So please consider joining us there. And if you like the show, don't forget to leave us a comment or a review on iTunes. It helps more people find us. And if you get a moment, check out my website, SamithaFaye.com. Under webinars, I will have information on a 4-week mediumship webinar that Janice and I are going to be teaching to help you all awaken the medium inside of you. And we will talk about that in more detail on next week's show. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us once again. We hope that you remember to show up, do great work, and share your light. Have a great week, everyone.